I'm here with Noam Chomsky. As we all know, humanity is in a dangerous moment. Our kayfabe president, known for grabbing women by the pussy, has awoken an angry, ultra-nationalistic demon in America. Now, I can remember you speaking at Boston University of a Russian monster as the creation of the U.S. government during the Cold War. So imagine, if you will, our government taking a look at itself in the mirror and recognizing itself for what it is, recognizing Trump's bigotry and hate and gluttony and all that as a physical monster. What gave birth to this monster? How do we get to Trump? What is this Trump monster?
Well, the Trump monster happens to be unique. We have never had anything like this in American history. It's hard to find examples in world history, if there are any. But there's a background, of course. The country has gone through, it hasn't been a completely monstrous country by any means. So, for example, the period from FDR into the 70s had many positive aspects. The country overcame many of the really serious, ugly, brutal aspects of its past. And there were many achievements during that period. They were not gifts from above. They were the result of popular, dedicated activism from the labor movement activism in the 1930s that led to the New Deal, to the civil activism of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and so on, made a big difference in the country. Now, if you look back at the total history, it's not a pretty story. Take the American Revolution. Why was the revolution fought? Well, it wasn't so much taxation without representation. That was a minor part. The British had imposed a regulation, a royal proclamation in 1763, which prevented the colonists from moving beyond the Appalachian Mountains. They weren't, this was the territory of the Indian nations. And the British said, you can't encroach. The settlers weren't having any of that. They wanted to conquer the Indian nations and expand. That was not only true of settlers, but also of great land speculators like George Washington. So you had to overthrow the 1763 ban. There was also a concern about slavery. It was, of course, a slave country. In fact, it imposed the most vicious system of slavery in human history. And virtually all of the founders were slave owners. And there was concern that the British might be moving towards banning slavery. It was not an idle concern for the slave owners. In fact, in 1772, not long before the revolution, the leading jurist in England, the most respected one, Lord Mansfield, had declared slavery to be so odious that it could not exist within Britain, could exist within the British colonies. But remember that the American colonies were not British colonies. They were considered a kind of an extension of England into the New World. And they were concerned that this might reach to them. That would be devastating for the American economy. These two elements, slavery and conquest, are just right there from the first days of the establishment of the Republic, pretty much on to the present. Conquest went on right through the 19th century, conquest and extermination of the native populations, also conquering half of Mexico in the process, conquering Florida, all vicious racist wars. After 1900, it just extended to much of the world. As for slavery, in some sense, it's barely ended. But technically, slavery ended after the Civil War, and for a few years it did, the Reconstruction period. 1877, there was a North-South Compact, which essentially allowed the South to do anything it wanted. And what they did was take the title of one of the major books on the topic, institute slavery with another name, basically criminalized the Black population. So if a Black man is standing on a street corner, he can be charged with vagrancy, given a fine that he can't pay, he goes into the prison system, becomes a slave worker. That's how the Second Industrial Revolution developed, with largely slave labor in the prison system. And for the employers, that's much better than slavery. If you have a slave, you have to keep him alive. If the government offers you what are called workers for nothing, they keep them alive. They control them. They're not going to strike or have no right. But that went on almost to the Second World War. Second World War, the industries needed workers. So there was, I can remember as a child when all the Black domestic workers disappeared because they were going into the war industry. Man could get a job as an auto worker and so on. And that continued for the major growth period, expansion in the 50s and the 60s. So then there were some opportunities for Afro-Americans, but the main ones were cut off by racism. Federal laws required that federally supported housing be segregated, only white. So Levittowns and other inexpensive housing was being developed all over the country, not for Blacks. By the time that ended, we had begun to move into the period of stagnation for the working class, which has been going on under the neoliberal rules since the late 70s, Reagan basically. So it was too late to get into it. And there's plenty of racism remaining, but the Afro-American communities today are suffering from 400 years of slavery, virtually slavery, repression, and racism. That's a large part of the history of the country. That's not the whole story by any means, but it's in the background. And we see it arising today. You see it in the Trump phenomenon. The Republican Party has had a dilemma for the last 40 or 50 years. Its constituency, prime constituency, is great wealth and corporate power. You can't win votes that way. You have to find something to organize a voting constituency for. So they've turned to what are called cultural issues. Some of it's pretty striking. In the mid-70s, when these problems were recognized, Republican party managers recognized that one way they could get votes from Northern Catholics and Southern evangelicals, those are big voting blocs. One way they could do it was to pretend, I stress, pretend to be anti-abortion. So they all flipped to be anti-abortion instantly. Before that, they were all pro-choice, strongly, in fact. Like when Reagan was governor of California in the 60s, he passed one of the strongest women's rights and pro-choice rights ever. But they all switched, so they now all pretend to be life. Same on guns. The gun culture is invented. It's worth remembering there was no gun culture in the 19th century. It was an agricultural country. People had guns, of course, but the guns were just tools, like a shovel or something. They didn't want the fancy stuff being produced by gun manufacturers. And after the Civil War, they didn't have a market. So they started the first great propaganda campaign in American history, inventing fake stories about the Wild West, the sheriffs fast on the draw and all this stuff that we believed when we were kids, you know, and kind of like the Marlboro Man and the tobacco industry later on, which used this as a model. And they invented this fake Wild West, and then came the ad saying, if you want your son to be a real man, he has to have a Winchester and so on. Out of that came an invented gun culture. The Republicans picked it up in the late, around the time of Reagan, realized this is another way to mobilize people. Let's pretend that guns are the main thing in your life, and we're defending your so-called Second Amendment rights, which is a joke. Read the Second Amendment. It doesn't even apply to the 20th century when you look into it. But this was concocted. Trump who's a monstrous figure, but a very effective confidence man. He's kind of like which is an old story in American life, you know, the P.T. Barnum fight, the guy who could say the Brooklyn Bridge. You read Huckleberry Finn, there was one of the main characters is the king who pretends to be the legitimate king of France. You come to him, he'll give you anything, you know. And Trump is an epitome of this. He's perfected the style of confidence man. And what that means is you serve your primary constituency, give the wealthy and the corporations everything they could possibly want, so they'll tolerate your antics. Meanwhile, shaft everyone else in the back, but pretend to be working for them, their man, their savior, and so on. And he's carried it off very effectively. And meanwhile, he's instituted programs which are absolutely devastating. You can kind of see the reasoning behind it in his mid-February budget pronouncements, budget proposal. This is mid-February 2020. Pandemic's raging. He's telling everybody it's just the flu, don't worry. Killing tens of thousands of Americans by those criminal acts. But out comes the budget proposal. What does it say? Continue to cut back funding on the Center for Disease Control. He'd been doing it right through his term. Let's cut it even further. Let's make sure that the health industry doesn't work at all, because that's good for profits. You increase budget in some areas. So increase fossil fuel subsidies. In other words, let's destroy the possibility of organized human life in another generation or two. Good for profits. That's right in the middle of the pandemic. That shows you class warfare at an extreme level, carried out by a skilled confidence man who can do this on the one hand while shafting everybody with the other hand and still maintaining their loyalty. It's a pretty good trick. That's the kind of situation we're facing. And let's bear in mind that bad as the pandemic is, particularly in the United States, which has the worst record in the world, almost everywhere in the world, it's either contained or more or less moving in that direction. Not here. It's getting worse. This is the only country in the world that cannot even provide data to the World Health Organization because the freak show in Washington is incapable of that. Now, what Trump is doing right now is, again, very clever, cynical, but clever, saying federal government can't do anything about it. It's the responsibility of the states. So you governors take care of it. Now, we're not going to help you. It's in your lap, the governors. And if anything gets screwed up, as it will, it's your fault, not mine. And if anything by accident happens to go right, I'll take credit for it. And Sean Hannity will say the next day was the most brilliant act in human history. And meanwhile, let's find somebody else to blame. So let's blame China or the World Health Organization or immigrants or who knows what it'll be tomorrow. But let's blame them to try to cover up my severe crimes against the American people and my huge crime of planning to destroy organized human life in the near future. Carrying this off is pretty amazing. And in fact, one of the most amazing parts is what's happening on the left, what's called the Never Biden campaign. That means we're not going to vote against Trump ever because it's a corrupt system. We've got to destroy the system. But what does it mean not to vote for Biden? If you know arithmetic, not a great request, you can understand in 1 minute that taking a vote from Biden amounts to the same thing as adding a vote to Trump. So if you say it's a corrupt system, I'm not going to vote for Biden, you're in effect voting for Trump. That's the consequence. Voting for Trump means voting for the destruction of the environment within a generation with two. It means packing the courts with so many young, ultra-right judges that for more than a generation, any mildly progressive thing is going to be stamped down and on from there. But if that, and that's, we see segments of the left doing this because the system's corrupt. Yeah, it's corrupt. Not as corrupt as they say. In fact, there's very striking movements to the left, but certainly there's plenty wrong with it. But to say, okay, let's fix that system somewhere down the road when we're facing disaster in November is a remarkable kind of blindness. So there are a lot of things converging to lead to a catastrophic outcome. None of it's necessary. There are very positive things developing too. They might overcome this, but it's a real major choice right now. Actually, one thing we should bear in mind, which somehow doesn't seem to be understood, is that for activists, for people who really want to change the world and change the society, elections are a very marginal thing. It takes 15 minutes to go into the polling booth and push a lever. Okay, want to spend 15 minutes on that, fine. But your activity should be elsewhere. Yeah, just like Bernie Sanders said in his last words, campaign may be ending, the movement goes on. The main thing is constant development of popular activist movements which don't stop. Just like class warfare by the business class never stops. Now, the activism of the left should never stop. It may stop for 15 minutes while you push a lever, but then you go back to what you're doing. You shouldn't be trapped in the propaganda that says politics means show up every 4 years and then go home. That's what they'd like politics to mean, but we shouldn't accept that. Politics means the constant activism day by day, taking off 15 minutes at one point every 4 years to push a lever and then continue. So those are all important things to keep in mind.
It wasn't something that I wanted to talk about, but since you bring up the Never Biden movement, I've heard a lot of pushback from the things you've said about that, even from your friend Glenn Greenwald, and having done hundreds of interviews all across the country, the Burn Your Bus movement, or if you will, they are of the position that their vote needs to be earned, and they're okay with another 4 years of Donald Trump. And they say, we're not blue no matter who, and you have to come to us. But
nice for Biden to say, hey, come Bernie, you take over. Would also be nice to have, workers' control of industry. But you don't get it by going like that. Okay. It's obviously not going to happen. So why say I'd like to have that, and if I don't have that, I'm going to go home and elect Donald Trump and ensure that nothing will be possible. Ensure 4 more years of destruction of the environment to the point where we may pass irreversible tipping points, making sure that no progressive actions will ever be implemented because the courts will be stuffed by young, ultra-right judges who will block anything that happens. I'll have the military expanded to the sky, tear apart the arms control regime, open the way to nuclear war, and I'll do that because I didn't get what I wanted, okay? Not that I have any plan to do anything else. I mean, the idea that I'm going to press Biden to drop out and pick Trump, pick Sanders is, so off the wall that we don't have to waste any time talking about it. But you're right, a lot of people think that. And I think they're just not thinking. They're not thinking through what the consequences of their actions.
Can you speak to me just a little bit about the nexus between Trump's rhetoric and the profiteering off of the suffering of others?
It's pretty obvious. Take a look at his budget again. Cut back anything that might be beneficial to people, including healthcare right in the middle of an pandemic, and subsidize the fossil fuel industry. Okay? What more do we want to know? Now, of course, that happens all the time. Take a look at the so-called stimulus bill. It's a good thing to have something after this, the current conditions. Who's the money going to? I mean, $50 billion are going to the airlines. What did you need $50 billion? Since like the rest of the corporate sector, they've been gorging since the last near recession. They've been they spent actually close to $50 billion that they're asking for just in buybacks to inflate the value of their stock and enrich the corporate managers and CEOs. Now they're saying, "I'm sorry, we want to get $50 billion back." How about instead of that, taking over the airlines? Okay, socializing. So you guys obviously can't run it. Society will run it. The fossil fuel industry is collapsing. In fact, if you look at today's news, they have to pay to take their oil. Instead of subsidizing them, how about taking them over? Take them over and put them out of business. That's the only way to save society. It can be done. It's actually not even that expensive right now. So let's do that instead of subsidizing. We can go on. At the very least, any subsidy that's given should be with conditionalities, strong conditionalities. No buybacks, no tax havens, workers on the management board, not only a minimum wage, but a living wage. All of those are the conditions that you have to accept or you don't get a penny from us taxpayers. All of these things would be possible. And in fact, they would be possible if you had a strong popular movement of the Sanders type kicking in the doors right now. If you have Trump, it's hopeless, of course. He's just going to serve his masters as he's always been doing. And you can run through plenty of this, on and on. The money should be coming to people, not to employers. Remember that you want to talk about the corruptness of our system. This goes back pre-Trump. What happens to a working guy who loses his job, loses his insurance? We're the only major. Can you think of another country that doesn't have universal health care? I mean, try to find one. Yeah, you can find one somewhere or other. Almost everybody has it. We don't. So that means you lose your job, you lose your health care, which is what's called employer-funded health care, which is another delusion, because the employer funding basically comes out of your salary. They're not paying for it. You are by having lower wages, but you lose that. Okay. Actually, the United States has a universal healthcare system. It's called emergency rooms. If you're so desperate that you can't get any care, you can go to the emergency room, the most savage, cruel, expensive form of healthcare you can imagine. Well, that's it. Does it have to be like that? Certainly doesn't. With Trump, of course, it will be. In fact, it'll be worse. But if you have Biden, no, you could push for it, maybe get it. In fact, he has not bad healthcare planks in his program, could be held to them. But if you want to have Trump, if that's what you like, fine, then do it. But don't pretend you're doing anything progressive. Sorry, you're not.
So I've been documenting a lot of what I've been doing in the past few years is documenting the rise of ultranationalistic violence in the wake of Trump's election. A lot of pro-Trump groups like American Guard and the Proud Boys. Can you speak a little bit about these kind of groups and maybe even go back to your paper from 80 years ago talking about the anti-Semitism and ultranationalism after the fall of Barcelona?
Well, I mean, my youth was consumed by the war against fascism, real fascism, not what's called fascism today, but real, authentic fascism. Fall of Barcelona happened to be the time of maybe the first article I remember writing. Looked like the spread of fascism was inexorable. Nobody knew at that time just how hideous it would be, but it was bad enough. It seemed you couldn't stop it. Right here in the United States, there was plenty of anti-Semitism, but not on the level of the Holocaust, not what blacks suffered, and it was there. So, for example, when my father happened to have a job, the only member of the extended family who had a job, but at one point, late 30s, he was able to buy a secondhand car into the Pocono Mountains for a weekend in the mountains. So he had to stay in a motel, but you had to look at the motels carefully because a lot of them had signs saying restricted. That meant no Jews. The blacks, you didn't have to ask. They couldn't come near it. But you had to find a place that would accept you. As a kid, I went to Hebrew school. We had to have police protection from the subway stop to the school. Otherwise, we wouldn't make it to the school. Once you're on the subway, you're on your own, sort of. But there were in Philadelphia, there were race riots so severe that at one point, when I was a teenager, there was a citywide edict that teenagers couldn't be outdoors after 7 o'clock. It wasn't just anti-Semitism, it was everybody killing everyone else. Incidentally, it was nowhere near as violent then as it is now. It wasn't guns, it wasn't you kill people, it was lesser forms of violence. But that's a large part of American history. It's being fanned by Trump. He loves it. That's a large part of his constituency. Goes back to what I said before about the fact that if you're shafting everyone constantly, you have to appeal to them on some other grounds. You have to silence that part and say, I'm with you because you're a white nationalist racist, so I'm going to defend you. Okay? It's almost required by the con job.
Charlottesville opened a lot of people's eyes to the far-right violence, and a lot of these alt-right groups use dog whistles like progenitors of Western civilization, suggesting they have an envy for the good old days. Even recently, the Straight Pride Parade in Boston, they bemoaned the loss of their social standing while simultaneously somehow celebrating the win of Trump. And then you've got all these people protesting in the streets, social distancing. Seems like it's the same people, literally, because I know I've documented many of them. Can you talk a little bit about that phenomenon and what might be driving these people?
Like take today with the protesters saying end the lockdown. I mean, are they interested in freedom? A lot of it is AstroTurf, funded by rich corporations, DeVos and her gang, other Freedom Works, other big corporations are organizing people to go protest. Contrary to what's claimed, the Trump voting bloc is fairly affluent, conservative, rural, petty bourgeois, not working class. But they're organized to this. A lot of them do it sincerely. A lot of them come from rural areas where there, of course, are not going to be many exposures to the virus. Those are in congested areas. So maybe they're trained to believe nothing's really happening. The left-wing conspiracy is inventing it, like what they hear on Fox News. Probably their people are sincere, but they're also organized and backed by Trump. That's part of his effort, clever effort, to pin the blame for whatever happens on governors. So tell the governors, we're not going to help you. We happen to have the resources, but we're not going to help you. It's in your lap. You do what you can, and we'll try to condemn you and denounce you and make it as hard as possible. And then if people get killed because of that, we'll blame it on you. Okay? It's ultra cynicism, but a clever tactic.
I do want to end on a positive note, but for my second to last question here, I'm going to go a little bit dark. Worst case scenario. Imagine the so-called leaders of the world, Trump or otherwise, have failed to act in a response to an outbreak like COVID-19. That leads to wave upon wave of deaths, population cut in half, economy collapse. So whatever it may be, Trump makes good on his threats of nuclear war. What chess pieces need to be on the board in order for this scenario to unfold, and how would humanity recover from such a catastrophic occurrence?
In the case of nuclear war, we can say goodbye to each other. Okay. I suppose that the worst case takes place, the Trump version on the virus. A lot of people will be killed, maybe millions, but there will be recovery, just as there was a century ago from what's called the Spanish flu, with tens of millions killed. There's not going to be recovery from the melting of the polar ice caps. There's not going to be recovery from the other ongoing harmful consequences of increasing the destruction of the environment, one of Trump's prime commitments. No recovery from that. Once that happens, we're toast. Okay. Afraid I've got to go off. Got another interview right underway now.
Can I ask you just one a quickie so we can end on a positive note? Imagine that there is a God or gods, and they come back and they want your counsel to name the greatest achievements in humanity, or whether it be art, music, or whatever. What would you name and why?
I think the greatest achievements of humanity are gaining freedom and justice over a very broad range through constant struggle. The world is much better than it was even earlier in my lifetime, certainly far before. Those are really great achievements of popular struggle, which should never be stopped. Okay, and that can not only prevent the worst outcome, but can lead to much better ones. I mean, a much better world is within grasp, with a realistic look at what's happening. No descending into illusions and pretenses. Take a look at the real world, the opportunities available, pursue them. You can get a better world.
Thank you so much for your time. I love you for doing this. I hope you make it to the next interview safely, and you're avoiding all that COVID floating around.
Sorry to rush, but I think they're waiting for me right now.
That's quite all right. Thank you so much for taking the time. Take care.